Welcome to the Unraveling the Scriptures channel. You've probably noticed the similarities between indigenous peoples and those from Asia, especially East Asia. The physical and facial similarities between Native Americans and the Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Indonesians, and Filipinos are remarkable and eye-catching. But where do these striking similarities come from? Thanks to technological advances and genetic studies, we've been able to investigate and understand the fascinating origins of indigenous peoples, a mystery that has intrigued humanity for centuries. In this video, we'll explore the genetics and DNA study of these peoples, revealing surprising ancestral connections and their origins. Discover how ancient migrations influenced the physical traits we see today, and how these connections help us better understand human history. Get ready for an exciting journey through time and genetics as we uncover secrets that are hidden in our own cells. Don't miss the chance to learn more about the intriguing history of indigenous and Asian peoples and the connections between these two peoples through DNA. The Chinese people are made up of a diversity of individuals and ethnic groups connected to China, whether by ancestry, ethnicity, nationality, citizenship, or other forms of association. Among these groups, the Han Chinese make up the largest segment of the population, representing approximately 92% of the country's total population. In many languages, the term Chinese is often used to refer exclusively to this majority group. However, China is home to dozens of other ethnic groups, each with their own cultures, traditions, and languages, which may or may not share direct connections with the Han ethnicity. This diversity reflects the country's rich cultural composition and significantly contributes to its multifaceted identity. China, currently the second most populous country in the world, ranks just behind India in terms of total population. Its extraordinarily large population is marked by impressive density and remarkable ethnic diversity. Despite this, the Han Chinese predominantly define the national demographic. The Japanese are an East Asian ethnic group native to the Japanese archipelago. This group makes up approximately 97.4% of Japan's population, highlighting their dominance in the country. Globally, it is estimated that around 125 million people are descendants of Japanese, making this one of the largest ethnic groups in the world. Within Japan, approximately 120.8 million Japanese reside in the country, while about 4 million belong to the Japanese diaspora, known as Nikkei-jin, which is spread across various regions such as North America, South America, and other parts of Asia. In certain contexts, the term Japanese is used more specifically to refer to the Yamato people, who are originally from the Japanese mainland and make up the majority population of the country. However, in other contexts, the term can include distinct native groups from the Japanese archipelago, such as the Ryukyuan people, or Huyan, whose culture and language are connected to the Yamato but are often considered a separate group. Another notable example is the Ainu people, who primarily inhabit the Hokkaido region and have unique cultural and historical characteristics that distinguish them significantly. The Koreans are an ethnic group and nation from East Asia, native to the Korean peninsula. Most of the Korean population lives in the two sovereign states of the region, North Korea and South Korea, which together form the territory historically known as Korea. In 2021, it was estimated that about 7.3 million ethnic Koreans lived outside the peninsula, making up a significant diaspora. In addition to the Koreas, Koreans are recognized as an ethnic minority in several countries in East and Southeast Asia, including China, Japan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Uzbekistan. Outside of the Asian continent, large Korean communities have also established themselves in countries such as Germany, the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These groups, often organized in community networks, have made significant contributions to the spread of Korean culture and the establishment of economic and cultural ties between the Koreas and the rest of the world. In the broader picture, the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean populations form the primary ethnic groups of East Asia, often associated with the concept of Asians in global perceptions. When thinking about Asian peoples, it is common for Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans to be the first to come to mind due to their historical, cultural, and economic relevance. In recent years, Koreans in particular have gained growing global prominence, fueled by cultural phenomena such as K-pop, cinema, cuisine, and the increasing interest in the Korean language. These factors have helped project Korean identity beyond the borders of the peninsula, solidifying its presence as one of the most influential cultures today. A recurring question in studies of East Asian peoples is the genetic relationship between Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese. Are these ethnic groups genetically related? The answer is yes. Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese share a significant degree of genetic kinship and can be considered brother peoples in biological terms. While their genetics show striking similarities, there are also notable differences that distinguish them. Genetic research reveals that more than half of the DNA of Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese comes from an ancient population known as the Yellow River Neolithic farmers. This population, which inhabited the Yellow River region during the Neolithic period, contributed significantly to the genetic makeup of modern East Asian populations. Specifically, the Chinese have about 77% of their DNA from this ancestral group. While exact data for Koreans and Japanese vary depending on the study, both share a considerable genetic fraction with the Yellow River Neolithic farmers, reinforcing the genetic kinship between these populations. Additionally, historical factors such as migrations and cultural interactions over thousands of years have helped shape these genetic similarities. However, despite these similarities, there are genetic differences between the three groups. These distinctions have been influenced by thousands of years of local evolution, environmental adaptations, and the formation of unique cultural identities. Such differences can be observed in specific genetic markers, reflecting the complexity and diversity within these populations. A fascinating aspect of the genetic comparison between Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese is the high degree of similarity regarding their common genetic origin, especially in the DNA associated with the Yellow River Neolithic farmers. Both the Chinese and Koreans have approximately 77% of their genetic composition from this ancestral group, indicating a significant genetic kinship between them. This substantial percentage, representing more than 3/4 of the DNA of both groups, reinforces the fact that Chinese and Koreans are extremely closely related genetically. On the other hand, the Japanese, while sharing this same genetic origin, have a slightly smaller proportion of DNA related to the Yellow River Neolithic farmers, about 61%. Despite the difference in relation to the Chinese and Koreans, more than half of the genetic composition of the Japanese still comes from this ancient population. This characteristic places them within the broader genetic context of East Asian populations. These data illustrate that the Yellow River DNA constitutes a substantial part of the genetic heritage of the three populations, serving as one of the common foundations that historically connect them. While the Chinese and Koreans stand out with nearly identical percentages, the Japanese, although with a slightly smaller proportion, still share a significant connection with this genetic origin. This information not only highlights the historical and biological ties between the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese, but also helps contextualize the cultural and environmental distinctions that have shaped the evolution of each group over the centuries. After understanding what makes the Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese genetic siblings, with significant percentages of DNA derived from the Yellow River Neolithic farmers, 77% for the Chinese and Koreans, and 61% for the Japanese, it is equally important to explore the genetic differences that distinguish them. These differences, present in the components that complete the 100% genetic composition of each group, are as relevant as the similarities in understanding their diversity and evolution. An interesting fact about the Chinese is that, in addition to the Yellow River DNA, they possess approximately 33% of genetics originating from the Southeast Asian Neolithic farmers. This genetic component is shared with other Southeast Asian populations, such as the Indonesians, Cambodians, and other ethnic groups in the region. This part of the DNA reflects a closer connection of the Chinese with the populations of South Asia, which genetically distinguishes them from the Koreans and Japanese. On the other hand, Koreans exhibit less influence from this Southeast Asian genetic component, while the Japanese have even more notable differences. In Japan, for example, a significant portion of the DNA is attributed to ancestors connected to the Ryukyu Islands and the Jomon people, who inhabited the archipelago before the arrival of continental migrants. These genetic elements provide the Japanese with unique characteristics, distinguishing them from both the Chinese and Koreans. Thus, while genetic similarities reflect a shared past and common ancestry, differences indicate the influence of regional and historical factors, such as migrations and local interactions over millennia. In the case of the Chinese, the heritage of Southeast Asian Neolithic farmers highlights a stronger connection to Southeast Asia, while the Japanese show unique genetic traits related to their insular geography. The Koreans do not possess the 33% DNA of Southeast Asian Neolithic farmers present in the Chinese. In contrast, a significant difference between Koreans and Chinese is found in the DNA known as Amur Basin Hunter-Gatherers, ABHG, also called Amur River DNA. This genetic component is common among some native populations from Siberia and Mongolia, making it more similar to the indigenous genetics of these regions. Koreans have about 17% of their DNA from the Amur River, which genetically distinguishes them from the Chinese. However, there are genetic fractions that bring these peoples closer. 77% of the genetics of Koreans and Chinese are related, as well as 61% of the genetics of the Japanese, linked to the Yellow River component. An additional curiosity about Koreans and Japanese is that both have similar genetic components, which reinforces their kinship. In the case of the Japanese, despite 61% of their genetic composition being related to the DNA from the Yellow River, shared with Koreans and Chinese, they also have two other genetic components that are also present in Koreans, the Amur River DNA and the Jomon. The Japanese have these two components in proportions that highlight their genetic connections with the Koreans. Specifically, Koreans have about 17% of the Amur River DNA, and additionally 5.2% of the Jomon DNA, which further strengthens the genetic proximity between the two peoples. Compared to Koreans, the Japanese have 19% of Amur River DNA, a slightly higher proportion than the 17% in Koreans. This data reinforces the kinship between the two peoples. Additionally, the Japanese show a significantly higher presence of Jomon DNA, with 18.8%, while Koreans only have 5.2%. It is interesting to note that the Jomon DNA is related to an ethnic group native to the Japanese archipelago, considered the original population of the region. The Jomon represent an essential part of the Japanese genetic heritage. An additional curiosity about the Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese is that the DNA from the Yellow River, shared by these populations, contains about 43% of its genetic makeup derived from the Anatolian Neolithic farmer. This genetic component is common among European populations and is also present in proportions ranging from 30% to 40% in some regions of the Middle East, highlighting a long-standing genetic connection between these regions. I hope you enjoyed this video on genetics, where we discussed the similarities and differences in the genetics of Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese. Leave in the comments if you were already aware of these particularities and the degree of kinship that exists between these populations. As we saw, more than half of the DNA of these three nations is shared, highlighting that they are indeed sister populations due to their genetic proximity. Indigenous peoples are the pre-Columbian inhabitants of both American continents, before the arrival of European colonizers in the 15th century. The term also encompasses ethnic groups that maintain their identity with the pre-Columbian populations of the Americas. These populations exhibit an impressive cultural diversity. While some indigenous groups were traditionally hunters and gatherers, others engaged in agriculture and aquaculture. Many indigenous societies were responsible for developing highly complex social structures, which included everything from monumental architecture and well-organized cities to city-states, chiefdoms, kingdoms, republics, confederations, and large empires. Today, indigenous peoples continue to inhabit various regions of the Americas, forming significant communities in countries such as Bolivia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Peru, the United States, and Brazil. When we talk about culture, it's possible to observe that cultural practices in the Americas were often shared within specific geographic zones. In these regions, distinct ethnic groups adopted similar cultural traits, technologies, and related forms of social organization. A striking example is Mesoamerica, where millennia of coexistence and joint development among the peoples of the region resulted in a relatively homogeneous culture, characterized by highly complex agricultural and social patterns. Another well-known example is the North American plains, where until the 19th century, various nomadic peoples shared a lifestyle based on hunting, especially bison, and common subsistence practices such as hunting and gathering. Regarding languages, the linguistic diversity among indigenous peoples is extremely rich. There is a great number of distinct languages and language families, which dispels the myth that all indigenous languages are similar to each other. In reality, there are significant differences between dialects, languages, and language families, revealing a complexity that is often ignored or underestimated. Now, let's get to the main point of this video: genetic research on indigenous peoples' DNA. The study of the genetic history of indigenous peoples of the Americas mainly focuses on analyzing Y-DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA. Y-DNA is passed down exclusively through the paternal line from father to son, while mtDNA is inherited through the maternal line, passing from mother to all of her descendants, regardless of sex. Both types of DNA do not undergo genetic recombination, meaning that changes in Y-DNA and mtDNA occur only through random mutations over generations, without mixing between the genetic material of the parents. Additionally, autosomal markers, known as atDNA, are also used in studies. Unlike Y-DNA and mtDNA, atDNA overlaps considerably and is widely used to measure genetic admixture, allowing for the analysis of the average genetic ancestry across the entire human genome. This marker is particularly useful for understanding how isolated populations are related to each other in different regions of the Americas. Genetic analyses performed on mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, and Y chromosome DNA from indigenous populations in the Americas, compared with those from certain peoples in Siberia and Central Asia, especially Paleo-Siberians and Turks, have revealed a significant genetic connection. These studies indicated that populations in the region between the Altai Mountains and Lake Baikal are genetically closest to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This area spans territories in both Siberia and Mongolia, recognized as one of the central points for shared genetic origins. Furthermore, other scientific evidence strengthens the genetic link between Native Americans and peoples of Northern Asia, such as the Ket, Chukchi, and Koryak, indigenous groups of Siberia. Molecular studies and genetic analyses show similarities not only in genetic composition, but also in the distribution of blood types. For instance, Asian haplogroups A, B, C, and D, commonly found in the mitochondrial DNA of East Asian populations, such as the Chinese, are also widespread among Native Americans. This genetic overlap supports the theory of an ancient migration across the Bering Land Bridge as one of the main routes connecting the continents. Additionally, specific subclades of haplogroups C and D found in some Native American populations who participated in DNA testing showed significant similarities with subclades present in Mongols, Japanese, Koreans, and the Ainu people. The available genetic patterns have led researchers to propose two main theories regarding the genetic events that shaped the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The first episode is the initial settlement of the American continent, which is widely considered the determining factor for genetic diversity, mutations, founder haplotypes, and the genetic lineages that characterize present-day indigenous populations. The most widely accepted theory among anthropologists to explain this settlement is the Bering Strait theory. The second episode is the European colonization of the Americas, which had a genetic impact on indigenous populations. Human colonization of the Americas, or the New World, occurred gradually, initially from the coast of the Bering Sea. Studies on the diversity and distribution of microsatellites from specific lineages, particularly in South America, suggest that certain indigenous populations have remained isolated since the time of initial colonization of the region. The Na-Dene populations, including the indigenous peoples of Alaska, exhibit mutations in haplogroup Q of Y-DNA. However, these populations are distinct from other indigenous groups in the Americas due to various specific mutations in mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, and autosomal DNA, atDNA. These data suggest that the earliest migrants to the northern regions of North America and Greenland came from later migration waves. Recent discoveries from autosomal DNA analyses and complete genomes have provided additional insights into the formation of settlements and the external connections of indigenous peoples in the Americas with other populations. Studies show that Native Americans share a very close genetic relationship with the Paleo-Siberian tribes of Siberia, with ancient samples from the Malta-Buret culture, northern Eurasian populations, and also with ancient Beringians. Native Americans share a significant genetic affinity with East Asian peoples, including Chinese populations. A considerable portion of their genetic makeup is primarily derived from southern Chinese groups. The genetic ancestry of Native Americans is occasionally referred to as Amerindian, which largely overlaps with Paleo-Siberian ancestry. However, it differs from Neo-Siberian ancestry, which is associated with historical expansions in northeastern Asia and is currently predominant among Siberian populations. The ancestors of Native American peoples followed a single migratory route, likely through Beringia, and subsequently spread throughout the continent, reaching various regions of the Americas. The time frame for this process is still a subject of debate among scholars. On the other hand, there is evidence of possible contacts between Native Americans and Polynesians dating back around 1,400 years. Recent genetic studies have shown that paleo-indigenous groups, previously hypothesized to be distinct, are genetically identical to modern Native Americans. The controversial theory that the first inhabitants of the Americas came from Europe via the North Atlantic, based on similarities between Solutrean stone tools, Upper Paleolithic Europe, and Clovis culture tools, North America, has been refuted. The analysis of the genome of the Anzic child, associated with Clovis culture, revealed that it belongs directly to the ancestral lineage of Native Americans, with no genetic relation to Upper Paleolithic European populations. The dating of the formation of the genetic pool of Native American peoples varies among researchers, with differing interpretations spanning several millennia. During the process of colonization of the American continent, Native Americans emerged from the mixture of a lineage that diverged from the peoples of ancient East Asia. This group included populations from regions like China, Korea, and other East Asian countries. Scholars disagree on the timing of when migratory populations moved from southern present-day China to northern Siberia. In this region, these populations merged, or intermingled, with a Paleolithic Siberian group known as the ancient Northern Eurasians, who have a deep connection with European hunter-gatherers. This interaction gave rise to the indigenous peoples of Siberia and later Native Americans, or Amerindians. In percentage terms, genetic analyses indicate that Native Americans have approximately 32% to 44% of their ancestry derived from the Amur River hunter-gatherers, a genetic group also common among Koreans and Siberians. This proportion corresponds to the ancient Siberian native ancestry of Native Americans. The second genetic component of Native Americans, which complements the rest of their composition, is derived from East Asian populations, especially from southern China. This genetic contribution, which ranges from 56% to 68%, is associated with the Neolithic farmers of the Yellow River, and Neolithic Southeast Asian farmers. Interestingly, the ancestry of Southeast Asian Neolithic farmers is related to Austroasiatic peoples who show notable genetic similarities with Native American populations. These are the main genetic components that make up the DNA of the indigenous populations that inhabit both South and North America. A study conducted by researchers from Brazil, the United Kingdom, Germany, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, under the leadership of the Molecular Evolutionary Biodiversity Laboratory at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, reached this main conclusion. In addition to this research, several other studies also reinforce the Asian origin of indigenous peoples, highlighting their connection with the peoples of Asia. In the video, I discussed the linguistic and cultural similarities between certain Asian and indigenous groups, as well as the genetic evidence that proves this link. The origin of indigenous peoples indeed traces back to Asia. Take the opportunity to write in the comments if you would like me to bring more content about the genetics of different populations, including mysterious peoples that many people still know little about. For those who may not know, both the Chinese and indigenous peoples are descendants of Togarma, great-grandson of Noah. May God bless you all and see you soon.